Hi everyone and welcome back. We're now beginning Unit 1 and Lecture 3 of this course after concluding the introductory unit. In this lecture, we'll dive deeper into Plato's understanding of the good life. We've already explored Socrates' emphasis on the examined life in the Apology and the role of love in philosophy in the Symposium. Now it's time to see how Plato takes these ideas a step further in some other texts. In this unit, we'll focus on Plato's mature views in two key dialogues, the Gorgias and the Republic. Now, these works are extensive and really quite densely argued, so we'll only be discussing some select excerpts that illuminate some of Plato's most essential ideas about the good life in each text. We'll start by tackling some challenges to the philosophical way of life as Plato envisions it. Specifically, in this first part of the lecture, we'll consider the arguments made by a character named Callicles in a dialogue called the Gorgias. Callicles, one of Plato's most fascinating literary creations, offers an aggressive critique of the philosophical life, and we'll examine the details of this critique in some depth. One of the central questions to address here is the distinction between what Callicles sees as the rhetorical way of life and what Plato, through Socrates, sees as the philosophical way of life. Understanding the contrast between rhetoric as it's conventionally practiced and philosophy as Plato conceives of it will be a key focus of this first part of Lecture 3. Before we explore the details of the Gorgias, let's discuss the dialogue as a whole. This is a text that's concerned mainly with the nature of rhetoric, or the practice of persuasive speaking. Rhetoric was viewed as a crucial skill in Plato's time during the 5th and 4th centuries, and in this dialogue, he's especially interested in getting us to question the value of rhetoric as a skill, at least as it was practiced in his own day. The Gorgias also delves into issues of power and justice and the nature of human desire, but our primary focus will be on its inquiry into the value of the philosophical life in comparison with the rhetorical life. The dialogue falls into three main parts. In the first part, Socrates engages with the title character, Gorgias, and through his Socratic method of questioning, the elenchus, Socrates eventually refutes Gorgias' views on the nature of rhetoric. After this, Polus, Gorgias' pupil, enters the text, and he too faces a series of questions from Socrates and is ultimately refuted. The final and most extensive part of the Gorgias involves Callicles, who really goes after Socrates in the dialogue and vehemently disagrees with some of Socrates' core ideas. As you'll see in the assigned selections of the text, Callicles is not at all fond of Socrates' approach to argumentation. He takes issue with the way Socrates conducts himself in philosophical discussions, and he ultimately rejects the entire philosophical way of life that Socrates embodies, which prompts a key question that concerns Plato in the text, and that will concern us here. What's the difference between the life of philosophy and the life of rhetoric? Now, we'll be focusing on just a portion of the Gorgias, the part of the text in which Socrates faces off against Callicles. This is the final showdown in the text between the philosopher, represented by Socrates, and the practitioner of rhetoric, or oratory, represented by Callicles. Callicles is immediately offended as soon as he enters the dialogue by Socrates' methods, particularly how he feels Socrates has cornered Gorgias and Polus into defeat through clever wordplay. Following this, Callicles delivers what scholars often refer to as his great speech. This is a lengthy monologue critiquing Socrates' views in which Callicles takes issue with Socrates' ideas about the value of being just. He follows this up in the speech with an extended critique of Socrates' entire way of life. Callicles' primary issue here with the philosophical life seems to be its apolitical nature. Now, it's worth noting that in the background of this dialogue, there's the poignant fact that Socrates lost his life for engaging in philosophy. Plato seems to want us to ask, was it worth it? Is the practice of philosophy truly worth such a sacrifice? Callicles' answer here is a resounding no, and he elaborates on this in his great speech. This speech basically falls into two parts. In the first part, ranging from 482c to 484c, Callicles challenges the ideas that are embedded in conventional morality. that everyone deserves an equal share and that no one deserves more than others. Callicles develops an alternative view that he calls natural justice, according to which the strong and superior people in society should rule over and receive more than the weak and inferior many. In the second part of his speech, from 484c to 486d, Callicles goes further to criticize the practice of philosophy itself. He describes philosophy here as a frivolous and corrupting activity that leaves a person inexperienced in practical human affairs and ill-equipped to succeed in democratic politics. This is the sense in which Callicles thinks Socrates' way of life as a philosopher is inherently apolitical by nature. It's not a way of life that enables a person to succeed in public life, according to Callicles. So let's explore the intricacies of these two parts of Callicles' speech in greater detail. In the first part of his speech, Callicles introduces the idea of natural justice. He draws a distinction between what he calls what's just by nature, the Greek term here is physis, and what's just by law or convention, or nomos in Greek. According to Callicles, natural justice demands that the more powerful in society rule over and possess more than the less powerful. On this view, those who maximize their own advantage and get as much as possible for themselves are following what Callicles calls the law of nature. He supports this by pointing to the animal kingdom, where dominant figures like the alpha male in a lion pack naturally dominate others. Callicles also offers an account of how conventional justice emerges in societies. He critiques the democratic notion that everyone deserves an equal share and an opportunity to seek their own good. Callicles connects this egalitarian ethos with what he calls what's just by convention, or by custom, or by law. According to him, this conventional morality is nothing more than a sham, a conspiracy invented by the weak and inferior majority, the masses, to suppress the strong and superior few. Callicles firmly believes that conventional norms and morality are fabrications. In contrast, what he considers to be natural is his doctrine of natural justice, where the strong should rule over and get more than the weak majority. What he's arguing for then, in his first part of his speech, is that conventional morality is simply a tool that the many in society who are inferior use to control the strong and superior few. But for Callicles, this is a tragedy and an inversion of the law of nature, which is that the strong dominate the weak. So that's the first part of Callicles' speech. What about the second part? Here, Callicles launches into a pointed critique of the philosophical life, and he directs this squarely at Socrates. There's no better representation of this than Callicles' own words. The quote we have here encapsulates his main problem with philosophy. Let's read it together. "Philosophy is no doubt a delightful thing, Socrates," Callicles says, "as long as one is exposed to it in moderation at the appropriate time of life. But if one spends more time with it than he should, it's a man's undoing. For even if one is naturally well-favored, but engages in philosophy far beyond that appropriate time of life, he can't help but turn out to be inexperienced in everything a man who is to be admirable and good and well thought of is supposed to be experienced in. To partake of as much philosophy as your education requires is an admirable thing, and it's not shameful to practice philosophy while you're a boy. But when you still do it after you've grown older and become a man, the thing gets to be ridiculous, Socrates. When I see philosophy in a young boy, I approve of it. I think it's appropriate and consider such a person well-bred. Whereas I consider one who does not engage in philosophy ill-bred, one who will never count himself deserving of any admirable or noble thing. But when I see an older man still engaging in philosophy and not giving it up, I think such a man by this time really needs a beating." According to Callicles, then, while philosophy may be a fun way to play with words, it's only worth doing when practiced, as he says, at the appropriate time of life. He's thinking of philosophy here as a use of argument that a young person should engage in as a way to get ahead in politics. So you can think of philosophy here as the worst sort of debate camp. Callicles warns Socrates, though, that an excessive focus on philosophy is a person's undoing, rendering them inexperienced in the practical matters that are important to succeed in achieving one's ambitions. Practicing philosophy into adulthood, as Socrates does, is shameful, according to Callicles. It's for losers, and he goes so far as to say anyone still dabbling in philosophy when they're older really needs a beating. What's striking here is Callicles' emphasis on the way philosophy, when practiced at an early age, can help you dominate others in the social world. For him, philosophy is not an end in itself, but serves as a developmental stage, one that should be left far behind as a man matures and seeks to get ahead of others in politics. This line of thought clearly contrasts with Socrates and Plato's view, as we've seen earlier in this course, where philosophy is a lifelong pursuit aimed at achieving a greater understanding of one's beliefs and values. In a way, Callicles' criticism is a pragmatic one that might resonate with some people. When a person engages in philosophy later in life, he believes, it serves as an obstacle to real-world success, especially in the political sphere. His critique essentially is a challenge to the idea of philosophy as a good way of life. He argues the opposite. Philosophy is an impediment to achieving experience and competence in practical affairs. Alright, so now we have the whole of Callicles' speech in view. What should we do with it? Well, let's analyze it in more detail. Let's do some philosophy on it. One key question I want to explore here is whether the two parts of Callicles' speech are consistent with each other. In the first part of his speech, remember, Callicles rejects conventional wisdom and laws, which he claims are created by the weak and inferior many to suppress the strong and superior few. The problem is this doesn't really seem to square very well with the position Callicles has in the second part of his speech, where he seems less hostile to conventional norms and values and more enamored with popular opinion. Consider again the quote at 484d you see right here, where Callicles rejects philosophers for being inexperienced in the laws of the city and inexperienced in human pleasures and appetites. How can Callicles criticize conventional norms in the first part of his speech and then condemn philosophers for not being experienced in these same norms in the second part of his speech? On the surface, this seems to be a contradiction, where the two parts of Callicles' speech are inconsistent. The problem is that to succeed in politics in the way he recommends in part 2 of his speech, Callicles has to affirm the egalitarian values that he despises in the first part of his speech. That's a clear inconsistency, right? But now let's consider a possible solution for Callicles. Maybe he means that to succeed in public life and politics, you have to pretend that you're someone who endorses conventional morality and the good of others while privately seeking your personal advantage. In this way, you should publicly act as if you're promoting the common good, but secretly work to maximize your own advantage at the expense of others. This could potentially resolve the inconsistency between the two parts of Callicles' speech. He would then essentially be saying, play make-believe, put on a performance publicly that you endorse conventional morality and egalitarian values and the good of others, but all the while seek to promote your own status and reputation and gratify your own desires by getting as much as possible for yourself. Get others to think you're promoting their good without really promoting their good. But this solution presents a new problem. Living a life where you pretend to promote the good of others while secretly seeking your own advantage sounds exhausting. To succeed privately, Callicles must seek the promotion of his own status and the gratification of his personal desires through the exercise of power and influence over others. But to succeed publicly, he must seek to gratify the desires of the many. Such a life requires that Callicles balance a private persona focused on his own advantage against a public persona aimed at satisfying social expectations. This contradiction seems to be a deeper one than an inconsistency in beliefs. It's a contradiction in Callicles' way of life itself. It suggests a deep disharmony inherent in the rhetorical way of life that Callicles advocates. And it's worth contrasting this with Socrates' view of his own philosophical way of life. Recall what Socrates says in the Apology at 33a. Throughout my life, he says there, in any public activity I may have engaged in, I am the same man as I am in private life. So, from Socrates' perspective, there's a greater harmony between his public and private personas, and this can be seen implicitly as a criticism of the rhetorical way of life, which Plato is suggesting is inherently disharmonious. Much later in the Gorgias, we find Socrates say something to Callicles that crystallizes the fundamental conflict we've been discussing. The conflict between a life dedicated to rhetoric and politics, as Callicles understands it, and a life dedicated to philosophy. Let's consider this quote. "For you see, don't you," Socrates says, "that our arguments are about this. And what would a human being of even little intelligence take more seriously than this? It's about the way we're supposed to live. Is it the way that you urge me toward, Callicles, to engage in these manly activities, to make speeches among the people, to practice rhetoric, and to take part in the sort of politics that you people engage in these days? Or is it the life spent in philosophy?" And the Greek word here again is philosophia, literally the love of wisdom. The question Socrates is asking Callicles here, and that Plato's indirectly asking us, isn't just a theoretical exercise. It's a deeply practical concern he's raising that asks us to consider how we should live our lives. Should we lean into the manly activities of politics and rhetoric in the way that Callicles thinks of them, or should we dedicate ourselves to philosophy, as Socrates suggests? Now, I think it's crucial to note that Plato does not present these options as opposites. He's not saying you must choose either a life of philosophy or a life of politics. It's the life of politics as Callicles conceives of it that Plato has a problem with. For elsewhere in the Gorgias, and as we've seen previously in the Apology, Plato presents Socrates as a model of how a life devoted to philosophy can contribute meaningfully to the public good. On this view, philosophical inquiry serves to awaken people to ethical and civic consciousness. If this is right, a philosophical way of life is not in any way at odds with a life of civic engagement. Instead, it can enrich and inform it. So the question isn't about choosing philosophy or politics. It's about choosing social success, political status, and recognition, as Callicles would have us do, or a life of integrity and the pursuit of wisdom, the pursuit of some more meaningful understanding of ourselves and the world. This is a question that asks us to evaluate not just what we do, but who we are and who we want to become. This difference between Callicles and Socrates' ways of life is represented implicitly in the Gorgias as a background theme, and Plato seems to want us to piece together the elements of the comparison for ourselves. The central focus of Callicles and Socrates' discussion in the dialogue, however, revolves around the nature of the good life itself. Socrates' cross-examination of Callicles here begins directly after Callicles' great speech at 488b to 495c. And what he takes issue with particularly is Callicles' theory of natural justice. Callicles in his speech had claimed that it's naturally just for the superior few in society to get more than the inferior many. Socrates' first question to him here is, who exactly are the superior? What are the features or characteristics of such people? And what good things exactly do they deserve more of? It takes Callicles a while to answer these questions, during which he gets pretty upset with Socrates' relentless questioning. But he eventually answers that the superior in society are those who are most intelligent and brave in political matters, and the good they deserve more of than the inferior is the satisfaction of their most intense desires. In a passionate outburst at 491e to 492c, Callicles then declares that anything that impedes the superior person's pursuit of their own desires, conventional norms and laws, and even the virtue of self-control, represents a form of slavery. So the good life for Callicles is a free, hedonistic life that involves the experience of as much pleasure as possible. Once this development in Callicles' theory of natural justice is on the table, Socrates has something new to work with, a view of the good life as a life of maximal pleasure. And so this leads Socrates to ask Callicles a new question. Don't we often believe there are better and worse desires for us to pursue in our lives? And if this is right, doesn't each of us think there are better and worse pleasures to experience? In response to this, Callicles digs in his heels. There's no such thing as good and bad pleasures, he claims. All pleasures are equally good for a person, and the more intense the pleasure, the better. What's good for a human being, according to this view, reduces simply to what's most pleasant for them. This then raises a crucial question in the Gorgias that occupies Callicles and Socrates in an extended stretch of argument. Are all pleasures equally good for a person? Ask yourself, are there some things in your life that you think are not worth taking pleasure in? Or alternatively, are there things in your life you don't currently take pleasure in, but that you wish you could? If your answer to either of these questions is yes, then it seems that in exploring the question of how to live, one of the things we're led to do is take a stand on the quality of our desires. From here, it's a short step to asking which desires in our lives are worth pursuing and which pleasures in our lives are worth experiencing. And once we get to this stage, we're led naturally to put a new priority on the place of reflection in a good life, which leads us to the practice of philosophy. What becomes important to living well is not experiencing as much pleasure as possible, but figuring out what's worth taking pleasure in. This is exactly how Plato thinks of the philosophical life, both in the Apology and in the Gorgias, a life that involves reflecting on the values we wish to live by, a life governed by the pursuit of wisdom. Part of the problem, then, that Plato identifies with Callicles' way of life in the Gorgias is its deeply unreflective nature, and he sharpens this comparison of Callicles' attitude with the attitude of the philosopher by introducing what we can call a rhetorical ethos versus a philosophical ethos. On the one hand, there's a similarity between the rhetorician and the philosopher. They both use arguments and speeches and words, a use of discourse that has an effect on other people. But remember also how Callicles and Socrates have different views on what arguments and speech-making should achieve. This difference isn't just about the content of their arguments, it's also about the underlying ethos, or guiding principles that shape how they argue and engage with other people. In the rhetorician's world, this ethos revolves around influence and domination. The rhetorician uses arguments as tools to control the narrative and to sway public opinion. And this perspective aligns with what Callicles advocates for in his great speech, a life where success is measured by your ability to impose your will on others. On the other side, the philosophical ethos, as demonstrated by Socrates, aims not to dominate, but to clarify and illuminate. When Socrates engages in argument, his goal is not to win at all costs, but to achieve some understanding, to learn, and to teach. This is a markedly different approach to argumentation than Callicles' approach, and it's continuous with Socrates' claim in the Apology that his philosophical activities promote a civic good. But it's not just about argumentation either. Plato seems to suggest in the Gorgias that the philosophical life is also characterized by a different attitude toward others, an attitude of love and respect. And this connects, it appears, with the views on love that Plato promotes in the Symposium. When Socrates describes his love there for Alcibiades, and again in the Gorgias, this isn't an isolated sentiment. It seems to be an extension of Socrates' commitment to philosophy. So it appears the conflict between Callicles and Socrates' ways of life comes down in large part to a conflict between two different approaches to argument. Plato is making the point that if you view other people as adversaries or opponents, as Callicles does, then your arguments become tools for domination, in exactly the way that Callicles believes they should. On the other hand, if you see argument as a tool for learning, then you naturally view others as partners in a collaborative search for common understanding. And this aligns with Socrates' approach to argument. If this is right, one of the deep lessons of the Gorgias is that a proper engagement in argument requires a proper engagement with others. Whether we adopt a rhetorical or a philosophical approach to argument will guide not just what we say, but how we relate to other human beings. The choice here between viewing others as adversaries or partners is not just a tactical one, it's an ethical choice that reveals the kind of person you want to be. Well, this concludes our discussion of Plato's Gorgias and the first part of this lecture. We've examined the compelling challenge posed by Callicles to the philosophical life in the Gorgias, and how he's led to develop his theory of natural justice in a way that results in a hedonistic conception of the good life. We've also discussed how Callicles' challenge to Socrates' way of life illuminates a deep tension for Plato between two distinct ethical orientations, the rhetorical ethos and the philosophical ethos. We've also considered the implications of these orientations for how we engage with others. We found that the rhetorical ethos, as advocated by Callicles, creates a life fraught with internal disharmony, according to Plato, one where influence and power become a person's ultimate goals, but at the cost of their ethical integrity. In contrast, we saw how Plato presents the philosophical ethos, exemplified by Socrates, as a more harmonious way of life. This ethos invites us to view arguments not as weapons to dominate others, but as tools for mutual enlightenment. As a preview of what's to come in the next part of this lecture, we'll be extending these insights to a discussion of Plato's Republic, and we'll be focusing once more on the harmoniousness of the philosophical way of life, understood as the just life.